federal United Kingdom, what would it be, and is it possible? An idea which comes onto the agenda fairly frequently in the UK now is that of the United Kingdom becoming a federation. The Labour Party leadership at UK level has shown clear interest in this idea. The Welsh Labour government has certainly been supportive of something along these lines. The Liberal Democrats have got a longer term commitment to a federal United Kingdom, and various other commentators do talk about the issue. There's a connected concept sometimes known as radical federalism, which is connected to socially progressive ideas and the downward transfer of power towards people to control their own lives. So it's something which frequently occurs in UK constitutional debate. One of the issues it's connected to is that of the possibility of Scottish independence. Those who oppose to Scottish independence sometimes suggest that a federal system would be the way of containing a more autonomous Scotland within the UK political system. Another reason why people may support federalism is the idea of it being a vehicle for the empowerment of people and the dispersal of power from the centre, perhaps also in the process reducing the strain on UK level institutions. All of these ideas come forward, but what actually would a federal United Kingdom be? What does federalism mean? One way of defining federalism is as a system of government in which power is shared between a single set of country-wide level of institutions, the federal level, and a series of territorial states or provinces. The federal institutions would have control in areas like foreign policy, security and intelligence, defence, perhaps macroeconomic policy, while the states or provinces in each of their areas would have control in areas such as health policy and education. So there's this division of powers between the federation and between the federal level and between the states or the provinces or whatever those territorial units might be called. Both tiers would have their own distinct electoral legitimacy, so their own democratic base, and the apportioning of powers between them would be set out in some kind of written or codified constitution, and that constitution would be interpreted and upheld by some kind of federal or constitutional court, which would probably also have a role in upholding human rights set out in some kind of Bill of Rights or Charter of Fundamental Rights, whatever you want to call it. That's the basic idea, generally speaking, of a federal constitution. There are a number of famous federal constitutions around the world: the United States Constitution, the German Constitution, the Indian Constitution, the Australian Constitution. There are many others. That's the general system. How close, then, is the UK in its current condition to being federal? It does have, and has acquired since the late 1990s in particular, a set of territorial institutions which look to some extent like states within a federal system. In particular, the devolved systems of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland look a bit like those kind of states. There are also devolved bodies within England. So those entities do exist. We also have a Human Rights Act, which implements the European Convention on Human Rights, which was introduced in 1998, so again around the same time as the devolved systems we have now, that in some senses plays the part you might expect to be played by a Bill of Rights within a federal system. So we do have features like that which look a bit like the features you might associate with a federal constitution. On the other hand, in the UK, we don't have even distribution of power across a set of federal states which covers the whole of the United Kingdom. So in particular, there are parts of England which don't have devolution at all, and those parts of England which do have devolution, for instance to metro mayors, don't have as much power as the devolved systems in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. There are also some differences between those three Celtic devolved systems as well. So there are differences there. There are ways in which the UK isn't yet fully federal, although it's been moving in that direction somewhat since the late 1990s, one could argue. There's also a fundamental issue that the UK does not have a written, or some might say codified, constitution which can be treated as the supreme law of the system. In other words, a court cannot, in the same way as it might in a federal system, adjudicate on what the rules are and come to a final conclusion, even if necessary, striking down primary legislation or acts of parliament passed by the UK Parliament. Under the UK system, we still have a principle of parliamentary supremacy, or as it's traditionally called, sovereignty. In the end, the UK Parliament can have, if it wants to have, the last say. The existence of the devolved institutions is provided for not by a written or codified constitution, but by acts of the UK Parliament. And it can, in theory, amend or repeal those acts. There would be political barriers to that, but if it really wanted to do that, it could do that. Furthermore, the UK Parliament, if it really wants to, can legislate in policy areas that might be devolved. So in the end, if it really wants to change a policy for the whole UK, say with regards to health or some forms of trade regulation, it could do that. Again, there might be political barriers, but it could do that. And if it really was determined to have the last say, then legally speaking, it would appear to be the case that it can have the last say. So in those senses, the UK is not a federation, and some might say is some way from being a federation, and those powers which have been devolved are devolved because the UK Parliament's been willing to do so, and it certainly hasn't fully adopted a federal system. Those are some of the differences, but the question which might then arise is that how compatible with UK political traditions is the idea of federalism? Is it something that simply can't fit with the UK system, or might it work in some respects? There's some interesting historical evidence on this point. The negotiations between Scotland and England, which eventually led to the Treaty of Union of 1706, show that at the Scottish end there was interest in the idea of establishing a federal system. The opening position of the Scottish commissioners, negotiating commissioners, was that they wished to establish what they called a federal union, that there would be two parliaments within a general system. The English commissioners weren't interested in that, so in a sense the idea was never going to take off. But it shows that that kind of conception of what became Great Britain might be was there, that this was a route, a path which wasn't taken at the time, but was certainly considered possible or worth talking about, at least on one side of the negotiations. How serious it really was as a viable possibility, as I said, is another question, but it was there as an idea that some kind of federal system might work. As we move on into the 19th century, the idea of some kind of federal system for the UK gains some traction as a way of resolving what was known sometimes as the Irish question, that you could somehow accommodate greater autonomy for Ireland within the UK and avoid disrupting the structure of the UK by providing greater autonomy all round. This is the general concept. An Irish politician called Isaac Butt promoted this idea. Certainly by the 1870s, he'd become a firm supporter of it. Someone like Joseph Chamberlain in the mid-1880s was also interested in some kind of federal arrangement for the UK as a way of addressing the Irish question. And it's this continued to recur. The idea that rather than just having what was called home rule for Ireland, which was certainly an idea on the agenda, you could have home rule all round, as it was sometimes called, that all the different components of the UK could have some kind of federal state type control over their own affairs while reserving a lot of other powers to what was known at the time as the Imperial Parliament, the UK Parliament. Indeed, in June 1919, the House of Commons passed a resolution in favour of enabling the Imperial Parliament to devote more attention to the general interests of the United Kingdom, and this would be achieved through a measure of federal devolution applicable to England, Scotland and Ireland, and possibly also to Wales. So this was something that the House of Commons actually voted on in 1919 and agreed to, although the government at the time by this point weren't as keen on the idea, so it didn't go forward. But this concept has been around and it's on the agenda again now. The thing driving it now, obviously, is not so much Ireland as the issue of Scotland, as well as the more general issue that the idea that you can take some of the pressure off the UK institutions and also give people more autonomy and more direct democratic control over the things that affect them immediately. But what might be the stumbling blocks? We've seen that there are some constitutional obstacles, particularly this doctrine of parliamentary supremacy or sovereignty in the UK Parliament, and also that we haven't yet got all the way towards a federal system, even though we have introduced devolution to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So what might the barriers be? One issue is what to do about England. If we had a federal system in which England was a single unit, it would raise some difficult questions. England accounts for roughly 85% of the population of the United Kingdom, so that's about 55 million people out of 65 million people. If England as a single unit were to be given a voice within that federal system and within federal level institutions that reflected that population size, it would be completely dominant in all the decisions. What England wanted, England would get. And that might not be a very satisfactory arrangement for the other participants in the federation. On the other hand, if English presence within the federal level institutions was scaled down to give the other participants a greater say, that might not be satisfactory from the point of view of England. So there's a bit of a conundrum there. Another factor that you might throw in is that if you're devolving or transferring power from a UK of 65 million to an England of 55 million, there's not really much transfer of power gone on at all. You've still got a vast grouping, a vast political unit of 55 million, which isn't going to get some of those benefits of devolution or of being a state within a federal system that might be hoped for. These are problems, and one way around them is, instead of having England as a single unit within a federation, that England can actually be represented in a series of subdivisions. The problem here is that finding subdivisions that people within England will regard as acceptable and identify with is a challenge. I should also add there as well that some of the other parts of the UK, such as Wales or Scotland, might not like the idea of being considered as on a par with an English region rather than being on a par with an English nation, and that might be the implication of a federal system which had English subunits within it. So there are challenges there. In 2004, there was a referendum on the possibility of introducing a devolved assembly to the northeast of England. Had it been approved, the idea of the then Labour government was that it would be the first of a series of English regional devolved units that would be introduced after referendums. It was clearly rejected by voters in the northeast of England, and this was considered a big setback for the agenda of English regional devolution, which might eventually have pointed the way towards a full UK federation with English regions within it. That setback is taken by some as evidence that there isn't really an appetite for English regional devolution. If that's the case, then that's a barrier to a UK federation. However, many people over the years have argued in favour of a UK federation, and some of them have said that a England of the regions can and should be established within it to make it workable. And I think, for example, of Winston Churchill, who at the time First Lord of the Admiralty, gave a speech during his annual visit to his constituency in Dundee. Apparently in those days MPs went to their constituencies once a year. But in this speech he talked about the possibility of a UK federal system, and he explained the issue in following terms. Churchill said that England was so great and populous that an English Parliament, whatever its functions or limitations might be, could not fail in the nature of things to be almost as powerful as the Imperial Parliament, side by side with which it would have to live. And if there were, as there very easily might be, a divergence of feeling and policy between the English Parliament and the Imperial Parliament, the quarrel between these two tremendously powerful bodies might tear the state in half and bring great evils upon all. So here's another problem identified by Churchill, that an English Parliament would be so powerful that it would come into conflict with a UK Parliament. Churchill then went on to say that if the establishment of what he called a workable federal system for the UK was sought, then it would be necessary, as Churchill said, to face the task of dividing England into several great self-governing areas. So there's the task identified by Churchill. He came up with some proposals. There are many other proposals, but I would suggest that in this respect, Churchill's correct, and that if we are going to have a federal UK, and there is talk of this idea, then that's the particular issue that most importantly needs to be addressed. How do we find the sub-England units that can be incorporated into that federation?